Sometimes a single sentence spoken in the right language can reach a heart that millions of dollars never could. The soft melody of an old Italian love song drifted quietly through Romano's, one of Manhattan's most celebrated fine dining restaurants, where candlelight shimmered across crystal glasses and polished silverware beneath grand chandeliers. The evening crowd spoke in hushed conversations. Executives celebrated successful deals, couples toasted anniversaries, and visitors admired the elegant atmosphere that made reservations nearly impossible to secure. At the center of the dining room, Grace Collins moved gracefully from table to table in her neatly pressed white shirt and black apron, carrying herself with the calm confidence of someone who believed every guest deserved to feel welcomed. She smiled naturally, remembered names without writing them down, and somehow made every table feel as though it was the only one in the restaurant. Few people noticed her beyond the quiet efficiency of her work, and that was perfectly acceptable to her. She had never believed kindness needed an audience. The front doors slowly opened, allowing a cool autumn breeze to slip inside before the hostess looked up with immediate recognition. Ethan Romano had arrived. At 38 years old, the white Italian-American billionaire was known throughout New York as the founder of one of the country's fastest-growing luxury hospitality groups. Magazine covers praised his business instincts. Financial networks analyzed his investments. Yet those who knew him personally often described him by something else entirely. Every Friday evening, no matter how demanding his schedule became, he reserved time for dinner with the most important person in his life. His mother. Isabella Romano stepped carefully beside her son, her elegant cream-colored coat resting gently across her shoulders. Silver hair framed her warm face, and although age had softened her steps, it had never diminished the quiet dignity in her posture. She smiled politely at the hostess, answering simple greetings with a gentle nod, because speaking English had never become easy for her, even after years of visiting America. Ethan instinctively slowed his pace to match hers, offering his arm before she accepted it with the familiarity shared only between a devoted son and his mother. The hostess escorted them toward their favorite table beside the tall windows overlooking the glowing Manhattan streets. Grace noticed them immediately. She had served Ethan before, though never long enough for more than polite conversation. Tonight, however, she quietly observed the way he adjusted his mother's chair before sitting down himself, how he waited until she felt comfortable before opening his menu, and how his attention remained fixed on her rather than on the expensive watch resting beneath his cuff. Those small gestures told Grace more about him than newspaper headlines ever could. A few moments later, she approached their table carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Good evening, Mr. Romano. Welcome back." Ethan looked up with a courteous smile. "Thank you." Before Grace could continue, Isabella pointed gently toward the menu, her expression becoming uncertain. She spoke softly in Italian, searching for the right English words, but finding only hesitation instead. The nearby waiter assisting another table glanced over with concern, unable to understand what she was trying to explain. Ethan immediately leaned forward, ready to translate for his mother as he had done countless times before. Grace remained still for only a heartbeat. Then she looked at Isabella with the warmest smile of the evening and answered in flawless Italian, her pronunciation carrying the natural rhythm of someone who had lived inside the language rather than simply studied it. Isabella's eyes widened in complete surprise. The uncertainty disappeared from her face almost instantly, replaced by joyful relief as she answered without hesitation. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, gentle and familiar, as though 2 old friends had unexpectedly met far from home. Across the table, Ethan slowly lowered the menu still resting in his hands. He stared at Grace, unable to hide his astonishment. She had not merely spoken Italian. She had spoken to his mother with warmth, respect, and the subtle expressions only. Someone deeply immersed in Italian family culture would naturally understand. Around them, the restaurant continued as before, yet Ethan heard none of it anymore. The music faded into the background. The conversations dissolved into silence. All he could hear was his mother laughing softly in her native language with a waitress no one had truly noticed until this extraordinary moment. For several long seconds, Ethan Romano remained completely still, his attention fixed not on the menu before him, but on the effortless conversation unfolding between Grace Collins and his mother. Isabella's face seemed brighter than it had been since they entered the restaurant. She laughed softly, her eyes sparkling with the familiar warmth Ethan remembered from childhood summers spent in a quiet village outside Florence. Grace was not simply translating a menu or explaining ingredients. She was listening with genuine patience, answering each question with graceful respect, and choosing every word as though she understood that language carried memories as much as meaning. When Isabella mentioned missing a traditional soup her own mother used to prepare on cold evenings, Grace smiled gently before responding with a Tuscan expression that had become increasingly rare even among younger Italians. Isabella placed one hand lightly against her heart and laughed again, shaking her head in delighted disbelief. Ethan recognized the phrase immediately. His late grandfather had spoken those exact words almost every Sunday before family dinners. It was not something commonly taught in language courses or travel guides. It belonged to kitchens, family gatherings, and generations of shared traditions. Ethan lowered his glass of sparkling water without taking another sip. He had spent years traveling between Rome, Milan, Venice, and New York, conducting business with investors, government officials, and international executives. He had heard countless people introduce themselves by saying they spoke Italian. Most understood grammar. Some mastered pronunciation. Very few understood the heartbeat hidden beneath ordinary conversation. Grace did. She spoke without hesitation, but also without showing off. Every sentence sounded natural, never rehearsed. Isabella reached across the table and gently touched Grace's hand while thanking her in Italian for making her feel at home. Grace answered with quiet humility, explaining that it was an honor to speak with someone whose stories reminded her why she had fallen in love with the language years earlier. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Grace never looked toward him for approval. She was completely focused on his mother. The conversation existed only to make Isabella feel comfortable, not to impress the billionaire sitting beside her. Around the dining room, dinner service continued uninterrupted. Wine glasses reflected candlelight. Waiters carried beautifully prepared meals between elegantly dressed guests. Soft piano music floated through the restaurant, blending naturally with the quiet conversations surrounding them. Yet Ethan barely noticed any of it. He found himself watching the smallest details instead. Grace slightly leaned forward whenever Isabella spoke softly. She never interrupted. She waited until Isabella finished each thought before answering. Even her smile carried the gentle rhythm of someone who genuinely enjoyed listening. When the conversation finally paused, Grace recommended a handmade mushroom risotto prepared using an old regional recipe. Isabella immediately smiled with recognition and nodded enthusiastically. Ethan looked at the menu before quietly asking in Italian, "Where did you learn to speak like this?" Grace turned toward him with calm confidence. "It is a long story, Mr. Romano." Her pronunciation remained flawless, yet there was no trace of pride in her voice. Ethan answered in the same language. "I believe good stories deserve time." Grace offered a polite smile. "Perhaps after I finish serving my tables." She excused herself gracefully and continued across the dining room, greeting another family with the same warmth she had shown moments earlier. Ethan watched her disappear among the softly glowing lights before looking back at his mother. Isabella smiled knowingly. In Italian, she whispered, "She reminds me of home." Ethan slowly nodded. He had brought his mother to countless luxury restaurants across Europe and America, always searching for places that might help her feel connected to the country she loved. Expensive surroundings had never accomplished that. One sincere conversation had. He realized that what moved his mother had nothing to do with perfect pronunciation alone. Grace had spoken with respect, patience, and affection that could never be memorized from a textbook. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself looking forward to hearing not another business proposal or investment opportunity, but the untold story of a quiet waitress who somehow carried the warmth of Italy within every carefully chosen word. Grace returned to her evening routine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She thanked the kitchen staff each time a plate was placed into her hands, remembered every special request without consulting a notebook, and greeted arriving guests with the same sincere warmth she had offered Ethan Romano and his mother. If anyone had watched only her, they would never have guessed that she had quietly become the center of someone else's thoughts. Ethan, however, found it impossible to focus on anything except the mystery standing only a few tables away. His mother noticed immediately. Isabella smiled softly over the rim of her espresso cup before speaking in Italian. "You have been watching that young woman for the past 10 minutes. Ethan laughed quietly, unable to deny it. "I am trying to understand how someone from New York speaks like she grew up in Tuscany." Isabella gently stirred a spoon through her coffee before answering. "Language is easy to learn. Kindness is not. She has both." Ethan looked toward Grace again. His mother was right. Countless people had mastered Italian grammar. Few possessed the quiet grace that seemed to flow naturally through every conversation Grace held. She treated an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with the same care she gave a group of young tourists visiting Manhattan for the first time. She never hurried anyone. She never interrupted. She somehow made every guest feel heard before they ever placed an order. Ethan realized she was creating an experience rather than simply serving dinner. As the restaurant settled into its comfortable rhythm, Grace returned carrying freshly prepared appetizers. She carefully placed Isabella's dish before her before presenting Ethan's meal with equal attention. Isabella thanked her in Italian once again. Grace answered naturally, asking whether the seasoning reminded her of home. Isabella closed her eyes after tasting the first bite and smiled with unmistakable nostalgia. "Very much," she replied. "It tastes like Sundays with my sisters." Grace's expression softened. Food has a beautiful way of protecting memories. Ethan quietly repeated those words in his mind. Protecting memories. It was not the sort of sentence people usually spoke while serving dinner. It sounded more like something carefully collected through years of listening to other people's lives. "Curious," Ethan finally asked, "have you spent much time in Italy?" Grace paused only briefly before answering. "Not as much as people usually assume." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Then where did you learn everything?" Grace offered the same calm smile she had worn throughout the evening. From someone who believed language should never be separated from people. Before Ethan could ask another question, another table requested her assistance. She excused herself politely and crossed the dining room, leaving him with another answer that somehow created even more questions. Isabella watched her disappear among the softly glowing lights before turning back to her son. "She is protecting a story." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think that?" Isabella smiled knowingly. "Because people who speak from gratitude always have one." Ethan had learned long ago never to underestimate his mother's instincts. Throughout his childhood, she had understood people with remarkable accuracy after only a few minutes of conversation. Watching Grace move gracefully between tables, he began trusting those instincts once again. Near the open kitchen, a young server accidentally confused two orders and looked visibly embarrassed. Before the manager could intervene, Grace quietly stepped beside him, exchanged the plates with practiced efficiency, and whispered something that immediately eased his worried expression. No criticism, no public correction, only encouragement. The young server smiled with relief and continued working confidently. Ethan noticed the exchange from across the room. Grace seemed to leave every person a little calmer than she had found them. She carried no title beyond waitress. Yet people naturally responded to her, as though leadership quietly followed wherever she walked. Isabella finished the last sip of her espresso before looking affectionately toward Grace once more. "Some people inherit wealth," she whispered. "Others inherit wisdom. I believe that young woman earned hers." Ethan remained silent, watching Grace disappear briefly through the kitchen doors before returning moments later with the same peaceful expression. He suddenly realized that for the first time in many years, he was no longer interested in discovering what someone had accomplished. He wanted to discover who had shaped the person standing before him. Because somewhere inside that untold story, he sensed there was a lesson worth far more than anything money could ever purchase. The evening unfolded with the gentle rhythm that only an exceptional restaurant could create. Fresh bread arrived warm from the kitchen. Glasses reflected the soft glow of candlelight. Quiet laughter blended naturally with the distant melody of the piano, while beyond the towering windows the lights of Manhattan shimmered against the dark autumn sky. Grace continued serving each table with the same graceful confidence, never allowing one remarkable conversation to distract her from the guests who depended on her attention. Ethan watched her from time to time without making it obvious. He had spent years studying people during negotiations, learning to recognize confidence, uncertainty, ambition, and deception within a few minutes. Grace possessed something entirely different. She carried herself with the peaceful certainty of someone who never needed to prove anything. As dessert menus were placed on nearby tables, Isabella quietly folded her hands together and looked around the restaurant with thoughtful eyes. Then she spoke softly in Italian. "There is something I would like, but I do not know how to explain it." Ethan immediately leaned forward. "Tell me, Mama." Before she could continue, another server approached their table, hoping to help. Isabella smiled politely but struggled to describe a traditional Italian dessert she remembered from childhood. She searched carefully for English words that refused to come. The young server listened patiently but looked increasingly confused. He offered several suggestions, each one farther from what Isabella had imagined. Ethan prepared to translate, but before he spoke, Grace noticed the uncertainty from across the dining room. She excused herself from another table and approached with her familiar calm smile. Looking gently toward Isabella, she spoke in Italian once again, asking whether she meant a dessert her grandmother used to prepare during autumn family gatherings. One made with roasted pears, honey, mascarpone, and crushed toasted almonds rather than the more familiar versions found in most restaurants. Isabella's eyes widened with complete surprise. "Exactly," she answered almost instantly. "That is the one." Grace nodded thoughtfully before explaining that although it was not listed on the printed menu, the pastry chef occasionally prepared a similar variation for private requests using seasonal ingredients already in the kitchen. She offered to ask whether it could be made that evening. Isabella smiled with unmistakable joy and thanked her warmly. Ethan remained silent, astonishment growing with every passing second. When Grace walked toward the kitchen, Isabella looked at her son with quiet satisfaction. "Did you hear the way she described it?" she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. Very few people outside Italy even know that version exists. Several minutes later, Grace returned carrying a small handwritten note from the pastry chef. She explained that the dessert would take a little longer because everything would be prepared fresh rather than taken from the standard menu. Isabella happily agreed without hesitation. While they waited, Ethan found himself asking another question in Italian. "How? Did you know that recipe?" Grace smiled gently. "The person who taught me Italian believed every family recipe was another way of preserving history." Ethan leaned back thoughtfully. That answer revealed almost nothing, yet somehow suggested an entire life hidden beneath ordinary words. Grace excused herself once more as another table requested assistance. Nearly 20 minutes later, the dessert arrived on delicate white porcelain, decorated with simple elegance rather than unnecessary decoration. Isabella closed her eyes after tasting the very first bite. A quiet smile slowly appeared across her face. Followed by tears, she quickly brushed away with the corner of her napkin. They were not tears of sadness. They were the gentle tears that arrive when a forgotten memory unexpectedly finds its way home. Ethan reached across the table and held his mother's hand without speaking. He understood exactly what she was feeling. Grace had not simply arranged a dessert. She had restored an evening from Isabella's childhood that neither money nor luxury had ever managed to recreate. Across the softly illuminated dining room, Grace continued serving other guests with the same quiet dedication, unaware that one thoughtful act had become far more valuable than any extravagant gesture Ethan had ever arranged for the person he loved most. At that moment, he realized he was no longer curious only about the language Grace spoke. He had become deeply curious about the remarkable heart that guided every word she chose. When the dessert plates had been cleared away, the restaurant settled into the peaceful rhythm that always arrived near the end of an unforgettable evening. Conversations became quieter, candles burned lower, and the aroma of fresh espresso drifted gently through the dining room. Grace thanked the pastry chef before returning to the floor, never pausing to admire what she had accomplished. To her, making one guest feel understood was simply another part of the evening's work. Ethan watched her move from table to table with growing admiration. She did not seek compliments. She did not linger where appreciation had already been offered. She simply continued serving every guest with the same thoughtful attention. That consistency fascinated him more than anything else. Many people behaved kindly when someone important was watching. Grace behaved kindly because it appeared to be the only way she knew how to live. Isabella folded her napkin neatly beside her empty plate and smiled toward Grace as she passed once more. "Would you have a few minutes when your work becomes lighter?" she asked gently in Italian. Grace nodded with a warm smile. "Of course, Signora Romano. I would be honored." A few minutes later, after another server quietly covered her nearby tables, Grace returned carrying 3 small porcelain cups filled with freshly prepared espresso. She placed one before Isabella, one before Ethan, and kept the last for herself only after Isabella insisted with a gentle wave of her hand. They sat together in a quiet corner of the dining room where the glow of the chandeliers reflected softly across polished wood and crystal glass. There was no audience, no business agenda, and no expectation beyond simple conversation. Isabella looked at Grace with affectionate curiosity. "My son has been asking where you learned our language," she said with a smile. "Now I would like to know as well." Grace wrapped both hands around the warm porcelain cup before answering. "I did not learn it in a classroom." Ethan leaned forward slightly. Grace continued. "When I was 19, I volunteered at a community center while attending college. An elderly professor from Florence visited every Wednesday afternoon to help immigrant families practice English. His name was Professor Lorenzo Bianchi." Isabella's eyes brightened with interest. Grace smiled softly at the memory. "After class, we always stayed behind for coffee. He insisted we speak only Italian, but he never corrected grammar first. He corrected kindness first. If I answered too quickly, he reminded me to listen. If I translated words without understanding the emotion behind them, he would simply smile and ask me to try again." Ethan listened in complete silence. Grace's voice carried quiet gratitude rather than nostalgia. "One afternoon, I asked him why pronunciation mattered so much. He told me something I have never forgotten." She paused for only a moment before repeating the words in gentle Italian. Then she translated them into English. "A language is not a collection of words. It is the way one heart learns to knock gently on another." Isabella slowly closed her eyes as though hearing an old friend speak again. "That sounds exactly like an Italian grandfather," she whispered with a smile. Grace nodded. "He treated everyone that way. He believed respect should always arrive before vocabulary." Ethan looked thoughtfully into his espresso. During years of international business, he had attended countless language courses designed for executives. They emphasized negotiation, persuasion, and influence. None had ever mentioned compassion. Grace continued quietly. "Professor Bianchi passed away during my final year of college. Before he died, he gave me his handwritten notebook filled with family sayings, recipes, local expressions, and stories from Tuscany. He told me never to speak Italian to impress anyone. He said I should speak it only when it could help another person feel less alone." A peaceful silence settled around the table. The sounds of the restaurant faded into the background while Ethan considered every word she had shared. Suddenly everything made sense. Grace had never been trying to demonstrate remarkable language skills. She had simply honored a promise made years earlier to a teacher who believed that the most beautiful conversations began with genuine respect. Ethan realized he had spent much of his life learning how to speak so people would listen. Grace had learned how to listen so people would feel understood, and in that quiet difference he discovered a kind of wisdom that no university, business empire, or fortune had ever managed to teach. The conversation ended only when Grace noticed another table quietly waiting for assistance. She stood, thanked Isabella for sharing the evening with her, and returned to work with the same calm smile she had worn from the beginning of her shift. Ethan watched her disappear into the gentle movement of the dining room. But this time his curiosity had become something deeper. He no longer wondered how she had learned Italian. He understood that language was only the visible part of something far more meaningful. The real gift she possessed was the ability to make people feel seen. Isabella remained seated, slowly finishing the last sip of her espresso before looking affectionately toward her son. "Now you understand why I smiled the moment she began speaking." Ethan nodded. "I thought I was listening to someone who knew our language." Isabella answered softly. "You were listening to someone who understands our way of loving people." Her words lingered quietly between them. A few minutes later, Grace noticed an elderly gentleman entering the restaurant alone. His coat was neatly pressed but noticeably old, and he paused near the entrance with the uncertain expression of someone unfamiliar with elegant surroundings. Before the hostess could greet him, Grace walked over with the same welcoming smile she offered every guest. She spoke gently, guided him to a comfortable table near the fireplace, and handed him a menu without allowing even a moment of awkwardness to settle over the encounter. Ethan observed everything without saying a word. The gentleman studied the menu for several minutes before quietly asking Grace a question. She listened carefully, then smiled and answered with patient encouragement. Instead of recommending the most expensive dishes, she suggested a simple homemade pasta that reminded her of traditional family dinners. The man thanked her with visible relief. Ethan noticed that Grace never measured people by their appearance. Whether serving a billionaire, a tourist, or someone dining alone, her kindness never changed. Half an hour later, as the gentleman prepared to pay, he reached into his jacket pocket and suddenly became still. He searched another pocket, then another, his expression slowly filling with concern. Grace immediately noticed the change and approached discreetly so the surrounding guests would not become aware of the situation. The man quietly explained that he had accidentally left his wallet in the taxi after rushing to meet an old friend who had never arrived. His voice carried more embarrassment than worry. Grace listened without interrupting. Then she smiled warmly and said, "Please do not worry about tonight. We will take care of everything." The gentleman immediately shook his head. "I cannot allow that." Grace answered softly, "Then you may simply come back another day. We will be happy to see you again." She spoke as though extending an invitation to a neighbor rather than solving an awkward problem. The gentleman's shoulders relaxed, and gratitude quietly replaced embarrassment. Ethan had witnessed generous donations announced before cameras, fundraising dinners attended by celebrities, and charitable galas costing millions of dollars. Yet this small act of quiet dignity moved him more than any public display of generosity he had ever seen. Grace never glanced around to see who was watching. She never expected recognition. Her only concern was protecting another person's self-respect. Isabella noticed Ethan's thoughtful expression and smiled knowingly. Professor Bianchi taught her well. Ethan looked toward his mother. "How do you know that?" Isabella gently folded her hands together. "Because only someone who truly understands our culture knows that preserving another person's dignity is sometimes the greatest kindness of all." Ethan slowly nodded. In his world, success was often measured by what people gained. Grace seemed to measure life by what she could quietly protect in others. As the elderly gentleman left the restaurant with renewed confidence and sincere thanks, Grace simply returned to serving the next table, carrying another tray as though nothing unusual had happened. Watching her move gracefully beneath the warm lights of the dining room, Ethan realized that the greatest lessons rarely arrived inside boardrooms or business schools. Sometimes they appeared in the quiet choices made by ordinary people who never realized they were teaching anyone at all. Closing time approached slowly, and the once lively dining room settled into a peaceful stillness. The final guests lingered over coffee, soft jazz replaced the earlier piano melodies, and the kitchen gradually grew quieter as chefs finished preparing the last desserts of the evening. Grace folded a clean linen napkin with practiced care before helping another server polish the final row of crystal glasses. She never hurried through the closing routine. Professor Lorenzo Bianchi had once told her that the last 5 minutes of any task revealed more about a person's character than the first 5. She had carried those words with her ever since. Ethan and Isabella remained seated longer than usual, neither eager to interrupt the calm that had settled around them. Finally, Isabella stood, smoothing the sleeves of her cream-colored coat before walking toward Grace. Without hesitation, she opened her arms. Grace looked surprised for only an instant before warmly returning the embrace. It was not dramatic. It was not formal. It felt like the quiet affection shared between relatives who had simply been separated by time. Isabella stepped back, her eyes glistening with gratitude. In gentle Italian, she said, "Tonight you gave me something I believed I had left behind forever." Grace smiled softly. Home is sometimes only one conversation away. Ethan watched the exchange without speaking. He had spent years trying to give his mother unforgettable experiences. Luxury vacations, beautiful homes, exclusive concerts, private dinners prepared by famous chefs. Yet a simple conversation in her native language had brought her more happiness than all of those gifts combined. As they prepared to leave, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and removed an elegant business card embossed with the Romano Hospitality Group logo. He offered it respectfully to Grace. If you ever decide you would like to work somewhere else, please call me. Grace accepted the card politely, but did not even glance at it. Instead, she looked at Ethan with the same calm expression that had quietly challenged every assumption he had made about her. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That is very generous." Ethan smiled. "You have not asked what position I had in mind." Grace's answer came without hesitation. "Because the position matters less than the purpose." Ethan lowered his hand slowly, almost laughing at himself. Once again, she had answered a different question than the one he believed he was asking. Isabella smiled knowingly between them. Grace continued gently. "I enjoy serving people here. Every evening someone arrives carrying joy, loneliness, celebration, grief, hope, or memories. Sometimes all they need is someone willing to notice." Ethan looked around the dining room one final time. He suddenly realized she was right. This restaurant had never simply been a place where meals were served. For Grace, it had become a place where people quietly found comfort without even realizing it. "Professor Bianchi must have been extraordinary," Ethan said softly. Grace nodded with gratitude. "He taught me many things." She paused before adding, "But perhaps the most important lesson was that every language has two versions. One is spoken with words. The other is spoken with the way we treat people." Silence settled gently over the three of them. No one seemed eager to break it. Outside, a light rain had begun falling again, covering the Manhattan streets with shimmering reflections beneath the streetlights. Ethan carefully placed his business card back into Grace's hand. "Keep it anyway," he said. "Not because I expect you to leave this restaurant. Because I hope our paths cross again." Grace smiled warmly and slipped the card into the pocket of her apron without making promises she could not yet keep. Isabella gently squeezed Grace's hand one last time before she and Ethan walked toward the entrance. Just before stepping outside, Ethan turned back. Grace was already helping another employee stack chairs for the next morning. She had returned to her work exactly as though nothing remarkable had happened that evening. Watching her disappear beneath the warm restaurant lights, Ethan understood something that had quietly changed inside him. He had entered the restaurant believing fluency was measured by vocabulary. He left realizing that the most beautiful language in the world was spoken through kindness, humility, and the quiet ability to make another person feel that they belonged. Several weeks passed, yet the memory of that evening refused to fade. Ethan Romano returned to his demanding schedule of board meetings, investment reviews, hotel openings, and international video conferences, but something subtle had changed. His executives noticed that he listened longer before speaking. Managers discovered he began asking about employees before discussing quarterly reports. Even routine meetings ended with conversations about people rather than numbers. No one understood what had inspired the change, but everyone quietly recognized it. One crisp Friday morning, Ethan stood in the executive conference room overlooking Manhattan, listening as his leadership team finalized plans for the annual Romano Hospitality Leadership Summit. Every year, the event gathered hotel managers, chefs, guest service directors, and executives from across the country to discuss excellence in hospitality. Traditionally, the keynote speaker had always been a well-known business leader. This year, Ethan slowly closed the presentation folder resting before him and looked around the table. "I would like to invite someone different." The room became still. One executive smiled politely. "A hospitality consultant?" Ethan gently shook his head. "A waitress." Several people exchanged puzzled glances. Another executive carefully asked, "Does she manage one of our properties?" "No." "Has she written a best-selling book?" Ethan smiled. "No." "Then what qualifies her to address 500 leaders?" Ethan leaned back quietly before answering. "She understands something we spend millions trying to teach." The room remained silent. "She knows how to make every person feel respected before they ever become a customer." No one immediately responded. Finally, the director of guest experience nodded thoughtfully. "That may be the most valuable qualification of all." Later that afternoon, Ethan personally visited Romano's once again. Grace welcomed him with the same warm smile that had never changed despite the passing weeks. "Good afternoon, Mr. Romano." "Good afternoon, Grace." There was no ceremony, no dramatic reunion, only the comfortable familiarity of two people whose respect had quietly grown through honest conversation. After lunch, Ethan asked whether she had a few minutes before her next table arrived. Grace agreed. and they sat beside the window overlooking the busy sidewalks below. Ethan carefully placed a cream-colored envelope on the table between them. Grace looked at it curiously but made no effort to open it. "This is not another job offer," Ethan said with a gentle smile. "Then what is it?" "An invitation." Grace remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Every year our company gathers hundreds of people responsible for welcoming guests into our hotels around the world. They expect me to speak about leadership, service, and excellence." He paused briefly before adding, "This year I would rather they hear from someone who practices those values every single day." Grace looked genuinely surprised. "You want me to speak?" Ethan nodded. "Not because you speak Italian." He smiled warmly. "Because you speak humanity." Grace lowered her eyes thoughtfully toward the unopened envelope. "I have never stood before hundreds of executives." Ethan answered quietly. "You have spent years standing before strangers who arrived carrying joy, grief, loneliness, celebration, disappointment, and hope. That requires far greater courage." Grace smiled softly but remained uncertain. "I do not know anything about corporate leadership." Ethan looked toward the restaurant where another server quietly helped a young family settle into their seats. "I believe you know more than most of us. You simply learned it somewhere different." Grace gently touched the envelope without opening it. "What would you want me to tell them?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Tell them what Professor Bianchi taught you. Tell them that language begins with listening. Tell them that every guest carries an invisible story. Tell them that dignity cannot be listed on a menu, yet people remember it long after they forget the meal." Grace remained silent for several moments, watching sunlight reflect across the polished wooden table. Finally, she looked back at Ethan with the same peaceful expression he had first noticed weeks earlier. "If I accept," she said quietly, "I would only speak about kindness." Ethan smiled with unmistakable gratitude. "That is exactly why I came." The annual Romano Hospitality Leadership Summit opened beneath the elegant crystal chandeliers of a grand Manhattan ballroom, where more than 500 hotel managers, executive chefs, guest service directors, and hospitality professionals gathered from across the United States. Every seat was filled. Large screens displayed the company's guiding principles, while quiet conversations drifted through the room before the opening session began. Many expected another presentation about revenue, innovation, or customer satisfaction metrics. Instead, Ethan Romano walked calmly onto the stage carrying nothing except a small leather notebook. The applause welcomed him warmly, but he waited until the room became completely silent before speaking. "The most valuable lesson I learned this year did not come from a boardroom, a business school, or a financial report," he began. "It came from a waitress." A wave of quiet curiosity moved across the audience. Ethan smiled gently before continuing. "Several weeks ago, my mother walked into a restaurant feeling far from home. One conversation changed that. Not because someone spoke perfect Italian, but because someone spoke with perfect respect." He turned toward the side of the stage. Grace Collins stepped into the light wearing a simple navy dress, her posture calm and her expression as peaceful as it had always been. She looked almost surprised by the applause that greeted her. Ethan stepped aside, offering her the podium without another word. Grace stood quietly for a moment, allowing the room to settle before speaking. "I have never managed a hotel," she said with a warm smile. "I have never led a corporation. I have only welcomed people one table at a time." The audience listened attentively. "Professor Lorenzo Bianchi once told me that every person who walks through a door is carrying a story that nobody else can see. Some carry joy, some carry worry, some carry memories, some carry loneliness. Our first responsibility is not to impress them. It is to notice them." The ballroom remained completely silent. Grace continued with the same gentle sincerity that had comforted Isabella weeks earlier. She spoke about learning to listen before answering, about remembering names because every person deserves to feel recognized, about protecting another person's dignity even during small moments of embarrassment, and about treating kindness as a daily habit instead of a special occasion. She never mentioned Ethan by name. She never described the evening that had brought them together. Instead, she simply shared the lessons that had quietly shaped her own life. "People often forget what we say," she continued softly. "They sometimes forget what we do, but they rarely forget how we made them feel about themselves." Ethan looked across the audience and noticed something remarkable. Executives who normally took detailed notes had stopped writing. Many simply listened. Some smiled thoughtfully. Others quietly reflected on their own experiences. When Grace finished speaking, she thanked everyone for allowing her to share Professor Bianchi's wisdom before stepping back from the podium. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained perfectly still. Then one person stood. Another followed. Within moments, every guest had risen to their feet. The applause was heartfelt, unhurried, and sincere. Ethan looked toward Grace with quiet admiration before speaking once more. My mother told me something after meeting Grace that I did not fully understand until today. She said language is easy to learn. Kindness is not. He smiled warmly. Grace, you did far more than speak to my mother in Italian that evening. Grace looked at him with gentle curiosity. Ethan continued, his voice filled with gratitude rather than grand emotion. You just stole my heart. Not because of the language you spoke, but because of the heart behind every word. Grace smiled modestly, lowering her eyes for a moment before looking back toward the audience. Outside the ballroom, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the city skyline. Inside, 500 hospitality leaders quietly carried home a lesson no textbook could ever teach. Ethan returned to leading his company with renewed purpose. Isabella often smiled whenever she remembered that unforgettable dinner. Grace returned to the same restaurant, greeting every guest with the same gentle warmth she had always shown. She never changed because applause had found her. She simply continued living the values Professor Bianchi had entrusted to her. And those who crossed her path discovered that the most beautiful language in the world was never measured by perfect pronunciation, but by the quiet dignity, compassion, and respect that allowed one human heart to truly recognize another.